Graphic Design and the Industrial Revolution, Chapter 9. With this chapter, we begin a more in-depth study of style, and you'll be tested on this starting with the Victorian era. Remember, all the style characteristics are listed in your syllabus, along with designer and artist names. Understanding where style comes from, when and why it existed, should be part of a designer's toolbox. Graphic designers want to make sure the style model they choose fits their client's message. Never forget, concept counts and historical form is an influencer, but not an end to itself. Remember, open your eyes and look around as well as back for inspiration. The Victorian era was a time of strong moral and religious beliefs, proper social conventions, and optimism. From a design standpoint, it was a time of aesthetic confusion. With this chapter, we begin our design timeline. The Victorian era lasted from 1820 to 1900. You can see here that I've listed the style characteristics as well as notable contributors. This information is also listed in your syllabus. The Victorian upper class had no TV or radio, so they had to entertain themselves. Family and friends would dress up in bizarre costumes and pose for each other. When someone died, they crafted post-mortem photography, trying to make the deceased look alive. They covered mirrors, and they wore black for 4 years. Gothic novels of that time included Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Edgar Allan Poe, our basis of modern horror. In England, it was the time of Jack the Ripper with poorhouses and workhouses. Still, family life was idealized, and it was modeled after Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The Industrial Revolution happened first in England between 1760 and 1840 and involved radical economic and social change. You see, society moved from agriculture to industry, and cities grew rapidly as people sought work in factories. Capitalists replaced landowners as the most powerful force in Western countries. Workers traded poor fields for urban factories with terrible conditions and wages. Handicrafts diminished, and humanist values were replaced with materialistic ones. People lost ties with nature, aesthetics, traditional and spiritual values. Type sizes and letter forms exploded. Photography was invented along with chromolithographic printing. It was a dynamic but chaotic time with new technology, imaginative forms, and new functions for graphic design. The French and American revolutions resulted in greater human equality, which led to increased public education and literacy and increased audience for reading materials. Graphic communications became more important and more widely available, and the era of mass communications dawned. A side effect of the factory system of mass manufacturing on graphic design was the end to the unity of design and production that had existed up until this time. That separation became a catalyst for the arts and crafts movement that we'll talk about in our next chapter, Chapter 10. We start with the letterpress poster. These advertising posters had organization along a vertical axis, a large variety of type sizes and styles, and few illustrations, if any. There were some horizontal divisions for the organization of information. A lot of advances in typography, photography, and printing during this period profoundly changed the nature of visual material. Typographic innovations included experimenting with casting large type sizes, the manufacture of large wood type, and the introduction of an abundance of imaginative new type styles and letter forms, many of which were influenced by the uninhibited lettering of chromolithography. Among the most significant new type styles were fat faces, Egyptians, and sans serifs. The design philosophy at the time was to use all available materials, both wood and metal type in various styles and sizes, rules, ornaments, and wood-graved or metal stereotype stock illustrations combined in a printed letterpress poster or broadsheet. Here we see Thomas Cotterell's 12 lines of pica. These display letters, shown actual size, seem gigantic to 18th century compositors who were used to setting handbills and broadsides using types that were rarely even half this size. Here's an example of a fat face. Although the record dates these designs to William Thorogood's 1821 publication, A New Specimen of Printing Types, R. Thorne's type is generally thought to have been designed around 1803. Here we see Vincent Figgin's antique font. The inspiration for this highly original design, first shown by Figgins, isn't known. Whether Figgins, Thorne, or an anonymous sign painter first invented this style is one of the mysteries surrounding the sudden appearance of slab serif letter forms. Here we see Egyptian type designs. Comparing this with Figgins' design reveals subtle differences. Robert Thorne based this lowercase on the structure of modern style letters, but he radically modified the weights and the serifs. Here we see an adaptation of Ionic that was even more subtle than the development of Ionic from Egyptian. Clarendon styles were wildly popular after their introduction. When the 3-year patent expired, numerous imitations and piracies were issued by other founders. Shade type makes an appearance. The first 3-dimensional or perspective fonts were fat faces. Perhaps designers were seeking a way to compensate for the lightness of thin strokes, which tended to reduce the legibility of fat faces at a distance. Here's a very decorative example. This specimen is Tuscan style with ornamental serifs. It really demonstrates the diversity of expanded and condensed width produced by 19th century designers. Here we see Vincent Figgin's outline font. In outline and open fonts, a contour line of even weight encloses the alphabet shape, which usually appears black. Here we see a reversed Egyptian italic, and types that appeared white against a black background enjoyed a brief popularity during the middle decades of the 19th century, then went out of fashion. Here's some ornamental fonts. The wide fat-faced letter forms provided a background for very busy pictorial and decorative elements. In contrast, we see the work of William Caslon. This specimen quietly introduced what was to become a major resource for graphic design. Here's a great primer sans serif type. Both the name and wide use of sans serif type was launched by awkward black display fonts in the Specimen of Printing Types from 1832. Steam-powered presses, the mechanization of paper, and the invention of machines to compose type led to the expansion of book publishing and a surge in the production of periodicals and illustrated weeklies. The printing process that had remained virtually unchanged since Gutenberg's printing of the 42-line Bible was radically altered in the 19th century. Here's an engraved illustration depicting the printing press of all iron parts, invented in England by Charles III, Earl of Stanhope. This chapter chronicles the inventors and inventions that led to the ability to capture an image with a camera. This included photograms, negatives, and wet and dry plate processes. Toward the end of the 19th century, the Kodak camera put the power of photography into the hands of the lay public. Before it was possible to actually print photographs, They were used as a research tool for wood engravings, which could be combined with type and then letterpress printed. The era of photographic reproduction began with the halftone screen, which produced the illusion of the continuous tone of a photo. Photomechanical color separation remained experimental till the end of the century, but during this period the aesthetic potential of photography was explored by artists and adventurers, and photography emerged as an important documentary and communications tool. Here we see an example from Talbot's Pencil of Nature in 1844. It was the first book to be illustrated entirely with photographs, and it had original prints that were mounted onto the facing pages. This is an advertisement for the Kodak camera. George Eastman's camera was simple enough for anyone who could wind a watch, and played a major role in making photography every person's art form. He was an American entrepreneur who founded the Eastman Kodak Company and popularized the use of roll film, helping really bring photography into the mainstream. Roll film was also the basis for the invention of motion picture film stock in 1888 by the world's first filmmakers. Eastman suffered from depression due to his pain, reduced ability to function, and also since he had witnessed his mother suffering from pain. In 1932, he died by suicide with a single gunshot through the heart. His suicide note read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait? George Eastman." This is attributed to Matthew Brady, the photographer. It's called Friedman on the Canal Bank at Richmond. Photographers supplied the visual evidence needed by illustrators to document an event. On the right, we see a wood engraving made by John MacDonald based on this photography. The tonality of the photographer's image is reinvented with the visual syntax of a wood engraved line. This timely image reminds us that about 400 years ago, a ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in Point Comfort on the shores of Virginia. The landing marked the beginning of slavery in British North America, forever transforming the modern world. Here's a famous photo called Dunker Church and the Dead. It was made in the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. This photograph really shows how visual documentation took on a new level of authenticity with the arrival of photography. Before photography, the Civil War was glorified, but this really showed how bloody war was. These are early motion studies by Edward Muybridge, where arrested movement in time and space eventually lead to motion picture photography. This is sequence photography, and it proved the ability of graphic images to record time and space relationships, making moving images a possibility. This particular image was created as a result of a bet, and the photographer set up a series of ropes connected to cameras that were clicked the minute a horse ran by. It was a bet to try to see if a horse's feet came up off the ground all the way when running a race. When someone died in the Victorian era, you had to cover all the mirrors with black fabric, because it was feared the mirror could steal the spirit and keep it. You weren't allowed back into society for the first 2 years after a death. All the clocks were stopped in a house at the exact time of death, and widows wore black for at least 4 years after the death of a husband, but most chose to wear black forever. In this time, post-mortem photography thrived. The trick of the photograph was to make the deceased seem alive, and great preparation was made to ensure they appeared to be alive in photos, or at least sleeping. The photographic process used was called daguerreotypes, which is essentially an image placed on a piece of silver an expensive luxury that not all could afford at the time. Post-mortem photos belonged to the wealthy, at least until the 1850s, when more and less expensive forms of photography were introduced. As photography began to monopolize factual documentation, illustrators gained a new freedom of expression and consequently turned toward fantasy and fiction, including colorful picture books for preschool children. This is the work of Randolph Caldecott. It's an illustration from Hey Diddle Diddle, and oblivious to the outlandish development, Caldecott's dancing dinnerware moves to a real driving visual rhythm. You may recognize Randolph Caldecott's name because the famous American Library Association Randolph Caldecott Medal is named after him. It represents the best illustrated children's book of the year. In addition, they have the Newbery Medal, the Pura Belpré Medal, and the Coretta Scott King Medal, along with others. It's a subject that's really interesting to me because my husband is a children's book illustrator, and this year, 2020, he did win the Pura Belpré Medal. But his dream, our dream, is that one day, maybe, just maybe, he could win a Caldecott. Here's the work of Kate Greenaway. It's a page from under the window. By leaving out the background, Kate simplified her page designs and focused on figures. And now we move to the style characteristics for the Victorian era. This is the first style that you'll be tested on. So you're going to need to learn to split this style from other styles, and these characteristics will help you find your way. The contradictory design approaches and philosophies of the Victorian era resulted in aesthetic confusion. Various historical styles, such as medieval letter forms, Baroque plant designs, and Celtic interlaces, were combined to form complex designs. The 18th century invention of lithography and the German development of using colored inks with lithography led to the development of what we call chromolithography. This is a planographic printing process that has meticulous and convincing tonal drawing and achieved remarkable realism through subtle color and really suited the sentimentalism, nostalgia, and the canon of idealized beauty that characterized the graphics of the Victorian era. Illustration, lettering, and decorative patterns could all be combined into a unified design on a lithographic stone. Here's a great example of chromolithography. It's the work of J.H. Buford and Sons and S.S. Frizzle. It's a poster for the Cleveland and Hendricks presidential campaign. Notice that the portraits of Cleveland and Hendricks look like a photo. Applications of the medium to commercial uses included art prints, posters, covers, books, magazine illustrations, ads, holiday cards, trade cards, scrap for album cards, and scrap was usually like wildflowers, butterflies, children, animals, and birds. Victorians collected these and assembled them in scrapbooks. There were experiments with printing on tin product packaging that resulted in a patent for offset printing. So here we see many of the characteristics of the Victorian era, including ephemera. Do you see that very busy border, that decorative border all around? Well, Victorians would love to cut that out and place it in a scrapbook. You've got an eagle, you've got Lady Liberty, you've got flags. So as you can see, this is a very good example of the Victorian era. At age 26, this German immigrant arrived in Boston. His knowledge of printing chemistry, color, business management, design and engraving, as well as printing, was of great value because he established a chromolithography firm in Boston. His work and influence was international, and his colorful work was really popular. He produced millions of album cards called scrap for Victorian scrapbooking. These beautiful art bits showcase the period's love of sentimentalism, nostalgia, and traditional values. In the late 1860s, he produced Christmas images suitable for framing. In 1873, he produced the very first American Christmas card. A full line of designs followed, including Easter cards, New Year cards, birthday, and Valentine cards. Too bad Prang didn't get a royalty on that one. Prang also made a lifelong contribution to art education after giving his daughter art lessons. He manufactured and distributed non-toxic watercolor sets and something he called crayons for kids, as well as art instruction books. Here we see a title page for The Pencil of Nature, and I think this design really demonstrates the eclectic confusion of the Victorian era. You've got medieval letter forms combined with Baroque plant designs and Celtic interlaces, creating a very dense, symmetrical design. Owen Jones' Grammar of Ornament showed patterns found in the arts and crafts of India and other regions. This is the most prolific illustrator of people in the Victorian time, Charles Dana Gibson. His images of young women and square-jawed men really established a canon of physical beauty in the mass media that endured for decades. The illustrations he created of women were dubbed the Gibson Girls. Here's an example of chromolithography printing. Art words move gracefully above 7 carefully composed musicians. We have large capital letters pointing to the 3 soloists, establishing a visual relationship between word and image. Here's another great example of naturalism and chromolithography. Its complex illusions are created by contrasting scale and perspective. We see a lot of ephemera, again, in this particular piece, along with this one. It's a poster for a printing press. This press made mass editions of chromolithographs possible. Take a look at the typography. I like to tell students if the typography is busy and decorative, or might look like it belongs on a circus wagon, it's probably Victorian. Here is an ad for portable carousels. These carousels were manufactured in Kansas and were really popular in Midwestern nomadic carnivals. Notice the dress of the people in the Victorian era, and that can also be a clue. Here's a poster for an industrial exhibition. I've actually been to Cincinnati and I've seen that building. It looks exactly like that. We see a buoyant optimism in industrial progress conveyed in this image, and look at the highly decorative type going on. Again, there's ephemera. You could cut some of that out. This is a theater poster where montage illustrations become overlapping planes with varied scale and spatial depth. Package designs chromolithographed on tin for food and tobacco packages use bright colors, elaborate lettering, and iconic images to create a really emblematic presence for a product. And this tin packaging is highly collectible. You'll find it in a lot of antique malls, and it goes for a good price. This was a good idea by the Victorian era because these packages are actually reusable. You could take this tin package and you could store paper clips in it or pens, and thus they survive to this day. It's a great idea in terms of sustainability. Here we see a multicolored woodcut poster celebrating 5 clowns attached to a circus. This is a poster for Harper's Magazine. An impressionistic quality is achieved as the illustration gets divided into 3 zones, with the middle Holly era providing a background for the message while separating the images. Here's an engraved after a sketch by a visual journalist in the field. This cover is a forerunner of news magazine coverage of current events. Political cartoons also found their way into the mainstream at this time. Now we turn to the modern era. The letterpress poster really inspired many contemporary designers. Among them are Hatch Show Print in Nashville, Tennessee. They got their start printing posters for the Grand Ole Opera, and now these posters, which are printed with letterpress type, are very, very popular and collectible. Here we see an example of Victorian-inspired packaging. And on the right, a poster that is a steampunk poster. Steampunk is a subgenre of science fiction or fantasy inspired by the Victorian era that incorporates technology and the aesthetic design of 19th century steam-powered machines into its art form. The packaging design was created by John Coltart.